In the mid-19th century, the American landscape was a vast tapestry of rolling prairies and silent mountain ranges where time moved with the slow rhythm of the seasons, and communication was a luxury defined by the steady clip-clop of a horse's hooves upon a dusty trail. People lived in a world of profound stillness, where the arrival of a letter was a momentous occasion, and the ink on the parchment often told stories that were weeks or even months old by the time they reached a distant hearth. The air was filled only with the sounds of nature, like the whispering of wind through the tall prairie grass and the rhythmic creaking of wooden wagons moving toward the setting sun. Even the telegraph, which was the pinnacle of technology at the time, was a series of rhythmic taps and clicks that required a specialized language of dots and dashes to bridge the gap between isolated towns. Imagine the quiet of a small New England village where the only sound in the evening was the crackle of a fireplace and the distant lowing of cattle as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep lavender and soft amber. There was no instant connection and no immediate reply because the world was vast and the miles were long and the silence was deep and comforting. Travelers would watch the stars at night and feel the immense scale of the continent, knowing that a message sent from the Atlantic coast might take a fortnight to reach the banks of the Mississippi River. Life was measured by the natural cycles of the sun and the moon and the slow turning of the earth. People found peace in the waiting, and there was a certain tranquility in the isolation because it allowed the mind to wander through the quiet spaces of the day without the intrusion of constant noise. The telegraph lines were thin threads of copper stretched across wooden poles that stood like lonely sentinels in the wilderness, carrying pulses of electricity that whispered secrets across the landscape. But even these wires were limited, and the human voice remained a local phenomenon, heard only by those within earshot of a parlor or a town square. The concept of hearing a loved one's voice from 100 miles away was nothing more than a dream or a ghostly thought floating in the mist of imagination. The darkness of night was truly dark, and the quiet was truly quiet, providing a sanctuary for sleep that we can scarcely imagine today. As the 1800s progressed, the world felt like an endless stretch of untamed beauty, where the pace of life was dictated by the strength of a team of oxen or the steady flow of a river. Every message carried the weight of the journey it had taken, and every word was cherished because of the effort required to deliver it. One could sit on a porch in the evening and listen to the crickets and the frogs and the rustle of leaves and feel a deep sense of belonging to a world that was slow and deliberate. The invention of the telephone was still a distant flickering light on the horizon of human ingenuity, and for now the world rested in a gentle slumber of distance and patience. As the shadows lengthened over the Appalachian trails and the Great Plains, the air turned cool, and the scent of pine and wood smoke drifted through the valleys, creating an atmosphere of utter serenity. There was no rush and no urgency because the limitations of the era demanded a slow and thoughtful existence. The stars seemed brighter in those days because there were no city lights to dim their glow, and the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of silver. Fascination with the invisible waves of sound that travel through the atmosphere like ripples on a still pond, he began to see sound as a physical thing, a gentle force that could be captured and understood if only one had the patience to listen closely enough. As he grew older, his bedroom became a sanctuary of small experiments where he would collect bits of wire and metal and wood to see how they vibrated when struck. He spent long afternoons in the Scottish countryside, lying in the tall grass and listening to the hum of insects and the distant lowing of cattle, wondering how those vibrations traveled across the fields to reach his ears. His mind was like a quiet library where every book was a different theory about the mechanics of speech and the mystery of the human ear. He was taught that every vowel and every consonant had a specific shape and a specific frequency, and he became obsessed with the idea of making these invisible shapes visible to the world. He would often play the piano and notice how certain notes would make the strings of a nearby instrument vibrate in sympathy, and he would sit in the dim light of the evening, pondering the harmony of the universe. His family moved to the rugged landscapes of Canada, where the air was crisp and the pines stood tall and silent under the vast northern sky. Here in the quiet of the Ontario woods, he found even more space to think about the nature of distance and the way the voice might one day bridge the gaps between people. He would sit by the Grand River and watch the water flow by, thinking about how a stream of electricity could perhaps carry a stream of sound, just as the river carried a fallen leaf. He was a tall and slender young man, with dark hair and eyes that always seemed to be looking at something just beyond the horizon. He moved to Boston, where the pace of life was faster, but his focus remained on the slow and steady work of teaching the deaf to speak and understanding the physics of acoustics. He spent his days in classrooms, using his father's visible speech system to help children find their voices, and his nights were spent in a small workshop, surrounded by the smell of oil and burnt wire and old parchment. His obsession with sound was not a frantic pursuit, but a slow and methodical exploration of the world's hidden frequencies. He began to imagine a device that could mimic the human ear, a delicate membrane that could catch the vibrations of the air and turn them into something that could travel along a wire. He worked with a quiet intensity, often forgetting to eat or sleep as he tinkered with reeds and magnets and tuning forks. The basement of his boarding house was a place of soft clicks and low hums, where the shadows danced on the walls as he adjusted his apparatus by the light of a single flickering lamp. He believed that if he could understand the harmonic telegraph, he could eventually understand how to transmit the complex waves of the human voice. Every failure was simply a quiet lesson, and every small success was a gentle step toward a future that no one else could yet imagine. His mind was always moving, like a slow-moving river, deep and steady and full of hidden currents. He would take long walks through the streets of Boston at night when the city was quiet and the stars were bright overhead, and he would think about the millions of people living in their own small bubbles of silence. He dreamed of a world where those bubbles could be connected by invisible threads of sound and where no one would ever truly be alone again. His work with the deaf kept him grounded in the human element of his invention, reminding him that sound was not just a scientific curiosity, but a bridge between souls. He would sit in his lab and listen to the silence of the room, feeling the potential of the air around him and knowing that it was full of music and speech that just needed a way to be heard. His hands were steady as he wound coils of copper wire around iron cores, creating the magnets that would one day pull the voice across the miles. He lived in a state of constant observation, noticing the way a door creaked or the way the wind whistled through a keyhole, and translating those sounds into the language of physics. The story of his youth is a story of patience and observation and a deep love for the quiet mysteries of the world. He was not a man of loud could travel through a solid object and emerge unchanged on the other side. His workshop was a place of shadows and soft textures, where the walls seemed to lean in to listen to the secrets he was trying to unlock. He would often work deep into the night, when the city of Boston had fallen into a deep slumber, and the only other souls awake were the watchmen and the stars. There was a meditative quality to his labor as he wound mile after mile of fine wire around wooden bobbins, creating the electromagnets that would pull at his musical reeds. He discovered that the secret to harmony was not just in the strength of the signal, but in the delicacy of the vibration, and he became a student of the smallest movements of the physical world. He would watch the way a flame flickered when he spoke, or how a bowl of water showed ripples when a carriage passed by in the street. and he realized that everything in the universe was in a state of constant, gentle motion. The harmonic telegraph was a puzzle of infinite pieces, and he moved each piece with a slow and deliberate hand, never rushing the process because he knew that nature does not reveal her secrets to the hurried mind. He faced many moments of doubt when the wires remained silent or the tones became jumbled into a chaotic noise, but he would simply close his eyes and breathe in the cool night air and start again with a fresh perspective. His belief was that if he could send music, he could send anything, and this obsession with musical tones was the bridge that would eventually lead him to the human voice, even though he did not know it at the time. He was like a gardener tending to a strange and electronic garden, waiting for the first sprout of success to break through the soil of his experiments. The quietude of his life during this period was essential for the birth of his ideas because it allowed his thoughts to expand and fill the room like the scent of dried lavender. He would take breaks to play his piano, feeling the wooden keys beneath his fingers and noticing how the entire instrument lived and breathed with sound. He imagined the entire world as a giant instrument waiting to be played by the fingers of electricity, and he saw himself as a tuner of that vast machine. The steady work on the harmonic telegraph taught him the language of the wire and the temperament of the current, and he became as familiar with the flow of electrons as a sailor is with the tides of the sea. Every evening he would return to his workbench with a sense of calm purpose, knowing that even if he did not find the answer today, the search itself was a form of peace. He would adjust the magnets until they were just a hair's breadth away from the reeds, and he would marvel at the invisible forces at play in the small space between them. The world outside was changing and growing louder, but in Bell's laboratory there was a sacred silence that was only broken by the pure tones of his experimental music. He was learning that sound was not just something we hear, but something that connects the very fabric of reality, and as he pursued the harmonic telegraph, he was unknowingly preparing himself for a much larger revelation. His mind was a vessel of quiet ambition, drifting on a sea of technical challenges, but always guided by the lighthouse of his curiosity. As the months turned into years, the complexity of his machines grew, but his spirit remained simple and focused on the beauty of a single vibrating string. He would often fall asleep in his chair with the sound of a distant hum in his ears and dream of a world where distance was no longer. Drapes in the stacks of old books, Watson found a quiet satisfaction in the physical manifestation of Bell's theories, and he marveled at how a simple piece of parchment or a thin strip of steel could become a gateway to a new dimension of human connection. They were like two weavers working on a giant tapestry of sound, each contributing their own unique thread to the design, and they moved with a synchronization that required very few words. Often the only sound in the room was the rhythmic rasp of a file or the gentle bubbling of a battery as it hummed with stored energy. Watson's technical expertise was the bridge that allowed Bell to cross from the realm of the impossible to the realm of the probable, and he did so with a humility that was as deep as his skill. He understood the soul of the machines they were building, and he knew how to coax them into life with a gentle touch or a subtle adjustment of a spring. As the months passed, they became more than just partners. They became two parts of a single mind, working toward a goal that was still hidden in the mist of the future. They would share simple meals of bread and cheese at the workbench, never wanting to leave the quiet hum of their experiments, and they would watch the moon rise over the harbor, feeling a sense of peace in their isolation. Watson's hands were often stained with grease, and his clothes smelled of the workshop, but his heart was light because he knew they were on the verge of something that would change the world forever. He was the craftsman of the future, building the vessels that would carry the human voice across the miles, and he did so with a devotion that was steady and unwavering. The relationship between the dreamer and the doer is a sacred thing, and in that small attic in Boston, it was perfected through the long nights of trial and error. Every prototype that Watson built was a testament to his craftsmanship and a reflection of Bell's vision, and they stood together on the shelves like silent watchers, waiting for the right moment to speak. The collaboration was a symphony of technical precision and creative fire, and it was the foundation upon which the entire history of modern communication was built. As you think about the two of them working in that quiet room, let your mind settle into the same steady rhythm of their labor and feel the comfort of a task being performed with care and attention. There is a deep sense of security in the presence of a master craftsman, and Watson's presence in this story is a reminder that even the greatest ideas need a steady hand to guide them into the world. The attic is warm and the light is soft, and the sound of the city is far away as the two men continue their work in the stillness of the night. Every movement is deliberate, and every thought is focused on the beauty of the mechanism and the wonder of the invisible forces they are trying to harness. The air is still, and the world is asleep, and the only thing that matters is the connection between the mind and the hand and the wire. As you drift towards sleep, let the image of Watson's steady hands winding the wire stay with you, and feel the peace that comes from a life of quiet purpose and meaningful work. The partnership was a gift from the universe to the future, and it was born in the silence of a Boston evening when the stars were the only witnesses to the birth of a new era. Sleep now in the knowledge that the world is being built by careful hands, and that every great discovery begins with a quiet moment of cooperation and trust. The story of the telephone is as much about the hands that built it as the mind that conceived it, and together they created a legacy that will never fade. The night is long and the rest is deep, and the echoes of their work are like a gentle shadows of orange and purple across the workbench, but neither man noticed the passage of time because they were caught in the gravitational pull of a magnificent idea. They worked with a renewed sense of calm and purpose, knowing that the silence of the ages was about to be broken by the first electronic greeting. The stuck reed was a tiny catalyst that changed the course of human history, but in that moment, it was just a piece of metal and a pair of curious hands in a quiet room. The transition from the harmonic telegraph to the telephone was like a seed suddenly sprouting into a vine that would eventually entwine the entire globe. Bell felt a deep sense of peace as he realized that his life's work with the deaf and his father's work with speech were all converging into this single point of discovery. He imagined the comfort that a voice could bring to a lonely heart, and the way a mother's lullaby could travel through a wire to soothe a child miles away. The laboratory was filled with the soft hum of the batteries and the occasional clink of a tool, but the real music was the silent symphony of possibility that was playing in Bell's mind. They realized that the human ear was the perfect model for their invention, a delicate drum that caught the vibrations of the atmosphere and turned them into something the brain could understand. As the night deepened and the stars began to twinkle over the harbor, the two men finally stopped to rest, their minds drifting through the implications of what they had found. There was no rush to tell the world yet, because they wanted to savor the quiet beauty of the discovery in the privacy of their own thoughts. The air in the lab grew cool as the humidity of the day faded away, and the only sound was the steady breathing of the two inventors as they contemplated the future. It was a moment of perfect equilibrium, where the old world and the new world met in the space of a single vibrating wire. As you listen to the story of this breakthrough, let your own mind find its own eureka moment of peace, and let the steady rhythm of the narrative pull you toward a deep and dreamless sleep. The world is full of hidden connections and invisible currents that bind us together in ways we are only beginning to understand. The laboratory is dark now, and the tools are at rest on the bench, but the spark that was lit that afternoon in 1875 still glows in the heart of every conversation we have today. Sleep in the knowledge that even the smallest accident can lead to the greatest beauty, and that the silence of the night is just a canvas for the voices of tomorrow. The story of the telephone is a story of listening to the quietest whispers of nature and finding the harmony that exists in all things. Let the soft echoes of the stuck reed carry you away to a place of perfect tranquility, where the only sound is the gentle pulse of your own heart and the steady flow of time. The day is done, and the work is finished, and the future is waiting, just beyond the horizon of your dreams. The morning of February 14, 1876, dawned with a cold and quiet intensity over the city of Washington, D.C., as the frost clung to the window panes of the government buildings and the streets were filled with the muffled sounds of carriage wheels on the winter pavement.
Inside the halls of the United States Patent Office, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, and the steady scratching of fountain pens as clerks moved with a slow and deliberate pace through the mountains of human ingenuity that sat upon their wooden desks. Alexander Graham Bell was not there himself, but his lawyer, Anthony Pollock, was moving through the corridors with a sense of quiet urgency, carrying a document that would soon become one of the most famous pieces of parchment in American history. This document was patent application number 174,465, which described a method for transmitting vocal or other sounds telegraphically by causing electrical undulations. At the very same time,
As you drift toward sleep, let your mind rest on the image of those two documents sitting on a desk in a quiet room in Washington, D.C., and feel the weight of history settle softly like a blanket of fresh snow. There is a peace in knowing that even the most complex human dramas are ultimately resolved through the passage of time and the steady rhythm of the days. The clocks continue to tick, and the earth continues to turn, and the stories of the past become the lullabies of the present. The room is warm and the light is dim, and the sounds of the world are fading away into a soft and gentle hum of memory. The race is over, and the wires are waiting to be strung across the landscape of the future, but for now there is only the silence of the night and the deep rest that follows a long and meaningful journey. Sleep in the tranquility of a world where everything happens in its own time and where the quietest moments often hold the greatest significance. The story of the patent is a story of a signature and a seal and a dream that was delivered just in time to wake the world. But now it is time for you to sleep and let the echoes of history carry you away to a place of perfect calm and silence. On the evening of March 10, 1876, a quiet hush had fallen over the boarding house at 5 Exeter Place in Boston, where the air was still and the shadows were long in the narrow hallways, as Alexander Graham Bell prepared for another long night of experimentation in his laboratory. The room was filled with the familiar and comforting clutter of a life dedicated to discovery, with coils of insulated wire draped like sleeping vines over the backs of wooden chairs, and glass jars of battery acid shimmering in the soft amber glow of the flickering gas lights. Bell was hunched over his latest creation, a liquid transmitter that sat on the workbench like a silent sentinel, waiting for a spark of life, while in a separate room down the hall, his loyal assistant, Thomas Watson, sat by the receiving end of the wire, holding a small wooden earpiece to his head and listening to the static hum of the universe. There was no grand audience and no fanfare, only the steady, rhythmic breathing of the old house and the distant, muffled sounds of the city settling into its nightly slumber. Bell was adjusting the delicate mechanism of the transmitter when a sudden, clumsy movement caused a splash of the acidic transmitting fluid to spill onto his clothes, and in a moment of natural human reaction, he called out for his friend with a voice that was clear and urgent, saying, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." He did not realize in that split second that he was not just speaking into a room, but into the very fabric of history, because the vibrations of his voice were captured by the liquid and transformed into a steady stream of electricity that raced through the copper wire at the speed of light. In the other room, Watson sat bolt upright as the silence of his earpiece was shattered by the crystal-clear sound of Bell's voice, arriving not as a series of clicks or a faint musical tone, but as the living, breathing words of a human being. It was a moment of profound and sacred stillness that followed, as Watson realized he had just witnessed the birth of a new world, where distance was no longer a barrier to the human soul, and he dropped the receiver to run toward the pillow. Let the image of the copper wire and the wooden earpiece fade into a mist of dreams, where the only sound is the quiet breathing of the night and the soft humming of the earth as it turns through the stars. The laboratory is quiet now, and the work is done, and the future is safe in the hands of time. Sleep well, and let the peace of that long-ago evening carry you into a dreamless and perfect slumber. The air in Philadelphia during the summer of 1876 was thick with the heat of a burgeoning nation and the humid breath of the Delaware River as thousands of visitors flocked to the Centennial Exposition to celebrate a century of American independence and progress. The fairgrounds were a sprawling tapestry of grand pavilions and white-domed buildings where the scent of freshly cut timber and popcorn drifted through the crowded pathways, and the sound of distant brass bands provided a constant rhythmic backdrop to the spectacle of human ingenuity. Inside the massive machinery hall, where the floorboards groaned under the weight of giant steam engines and iron looms, Alexander Graham Bell stood in a quiet corner next to a small, unassuming table that held his curious invention of wires and wooden boxes. He was a young man with tired eyes and a heart full of nervous hope, waiting for the judges to make their rounds through the sweltering hall, where the heat seemed to shimmer in the shafts of sunlight piercing through the high glass windows. The judges were exhausted after a long day of examining agricultural tools and industrial hardware, and they were nearly ready to dismiss Bell's table as just another scientific toy or a clever parlor trick for the amusement of the curious. Just as they were about to move on, a royal procession entered the hall, led by Emperor Dom Pedro II of Brazil, a man of great stature and an even greater curiosity, who recognized Bell from a previous meeting in Boston, where they had discussed the education of the deaf. The emperor greeted the young inventor with a warm and weary smile and asked to see the device that had brought him so far from home, and so Bell went to the other end of a 500-foot wire, while the emperor placed the heavy wooden receiver to his ear in the midst of the crowded and noisy hall. The world seemed to hold its breath for a single suspended moment as the emperor's face shifted from polite interest to a look of absolute and utter shock when the faint but clear voice of Bell traveled through the wire and into his royal ear. "My God, it talks!" the emperor famously exclaimed, his voice echoing through the rafters and drawing a crowd of skeptics and scientists who had previously looked at the invention with a cold and doubting eye. In that instant, the heat of the room and the noise of the machinery seemed to fade into a secondary layer of reality as the realization dawned on the spectators that they were witnessing the collapse of distance and the birth of a new era of human intimacy. The judges, including the world-renowned physicist Lord Kelvin, were suddenly invigorated and spent the next several hours huddled around the small table, taking turns speaking and listening to the miraculous electrical echoes that bridged the gap across the hall. The telephone was no longer a toy, but a revolutionary force that had captured the imagination of an empire and the attention of the world's greatest minds. The exposition continued for months, but the spark that was lit in that humid corner of the machinery and the soft glow of experimental lamps, Edison was hired to create a transmitter that would surpass Bell's original design, and he spent his days and nights surrounded by carbon and metal, trying to find a way to make the voice travel further and clearer than ever before. While the lawyers and executives in their high-backed chairs and oak-paneled offices began a fierce and quiet war of words and patents and contracts that would decide the fate of how the American people would speak to one another. The corporate battle was a slow-moving chess match played out in courtrooms and boardrooms, where the scratching of pens on legal parchment was the only sound of conflict, and the air was heavy with the weight of millions of dollars and the future of an entire industry. Yet despite the intensity of the struggle, there was a certain rhythmic monotony to the process as the months turned into years and the piles of legal documents grew taller and taller in the dusty archives of the patent office. Bell and his small team felt the pressure of this giant enemy, but they continued to work with a steady and quiet determination, keeping their focus on the wires and the voices, while the storm of litigation raged around them like a distant thunder that never quite reaches the quiet valley of the soul. Thomas Edison eventually developed a superior transmitter using carbon granules, which made the voice sound louder and more distinct. But instead of destroying the Bell Company, it only served to accelerate the pace of innovation, as both sides pushed each other to refine and improve the technology that was rapidly becoming the heartbeat of the American home. The fierce war for control of the lines was a story of giants moving through a landscape of shifting alliances and secret negotiations. But for the average person in a small town, it was just a series of new poles being placed in the ground and new wires being strung across the sky in a long and silent parade of progress. Imagine the quiet of a boardroom late at night, where the lamps are turned low and the maps of the telegraph lines are spread out like the charts of an ancient explorer, and you can feel the slow and heavy pulse of history being made one signature at a time. There was a peace to be found even in the midst of this corporate struggle, because it was a sign that the world was growing and that the human voice was becoming a force that could not be contained by any single company or any single man. The battle eventually reached a settlement where the boundaries were drawn and the roles were defined, allowing the Bell Company to emerge as the leader of the telephone, while Western Union remained the master of the telegraph, and the world breathed a sigh of relief as the two rivers of communication found their own separate paths toward the sea. As you think about the competition between these great minds and great powers, let your own mind find a place of stillness and let the sounds of the conflict fade away into the distant past where they belong. The legal papers are now yellowed with age, and the boardrooms are empty and quiet, but the wires that were born from that struggle still hum with the energy of 1 billion conversations. There is a deep and restful comfort in knowing that the struggles of the past have led to the convenience of the present, and that the world is now a smaller and more connected place because of the fires that were lit in those early years. The night is deep, and the shadows are soft, and the rhythm of the narrative is like a steady wave washing over the shore of your consciousness, carrying away the noise of the day and replacing it with the silence of the night. Sleep in the tranquility of a world where the giants have finished their work and the path is clear for you to rest and dream of a future that is bright and full of harmony. The air is cool, and the stars are watching over the sleeping nation, and the echoes of the corporate
Symphonies of small mechanical clicks and the soft murmuring of voices that flowed through the lines like a subterranean river, finally finding its way to the surface. Investors and engineers sat in quiet offices lit by the soft glow of green-shaded lamps, studying maps of the continent and drawing lines that would eventually connect the Atlantic to the Pacific in a grand and silent achievement of human will. They faced the challenges of winter storms that weighed the wires down with heavy blankets of ice and the heat of summer that caused the copper to stretch and sag, but they always returned to the task with a steady and unwavering hand. The company was building more than just a business. It was building a nervous system for a growing country, and the process was as natural and inevitable as the turning of the tides. As you think about the miles and miles of wire stretching across the mountains and the valleys, let your mind drift into the same state of calm and steady progression that defined that era of building. The world was becoming smaller, but the pace of life remained slow and thoughtful, and there was a deep sense of security in knowing that the wires were there to carry a message whenever it was needed. The poles stood firm in the ground through the wind and the rain and the sun, and they became a part of the permanent architecture of the American dream. The silence of the countryside was not lost, but rather enhanced by the presence of the lines, which carried the quiet whispers of a nation in transition. The rise of the Bell Telephone Company was a story of persistence and the belief that every human voice deserved to be heard, regardless of how far it had to travel to find a listening ear. The infrastructure was a gift of permanence in a world of change, and it provided a sense of belonging to those who lived on the fringes of the great wilderness. As the night falls over the modern world, you can still imagine the ghost of those early wires humming in the wind and feel the peace that comes from a well-connected life.
The work of the linemen is finished, and the poles are settled, and the network is complete. And now it is time for the world to rest in the cradle of the technology they created. The copper threads are silent now, and the stars are reflecting off the glass insulators that sit atop the poles like small blue jewels in the moonlight. There is no rush and no urgency, only the steady and peaceful flow of time through the vast and quiet landscape of the past. Sleep now, as the image of the stitching of the country fades into a soft and gentle blur of comfort, and let the rhythm of the history pull you down into a deep and restorative slumber. The nation is connected, and the house is quiet, and the night is yours to enjoy in perfect tranquility. The story of the infrastructure is a story of a long journey home, and you have finally arrived at the place of rest, where the voices are still, and the dreams are waiting to reach out and touch you with their soft and healing light. Sleep in the peace of the wired world. The emergence of the telephone operator brought a new and gentle rhythm to the world of communication as a profession grew out of the need for a human touch to navigate the complex and growing maze of copper wires that were stretching across the American landscape like the delicate silver threads of a spiderweb in the morning dew. In the early days of the telephone, the switchboards were managed by young boys who were often boisterous and hurried, but the leaders of the Bell Company soon realized that the system required a more patient and calm presence to manage the flow of human voices, and so the era of the Hello Girls began. These women became the vital heartbeat of the nation's nervous system, sitting in long rows within quiet, high-ceilinged rooms where the air was. The switchboards are glowing with tiny lights like a field of fireflies in the dark, and the soft clicking of the patches is a lullaby that speaks of order and safety and the enduring power of human connection. The Hello Girls have become a legendary part of our history, representing a time when the world was becoming faster, but the human heart still took the time to say hello and wait for an answer. The exchange rooms are quiet now, and the manual boards have been replaced by silent computers, but the spirit of the operators still lingers in the wires as a reminder of the care that was once required to bridge the miles. Let the image of the steady hands and the soft voices pull you deeper into the pillows and feel the weight of the day drifting away like a leaf on a slow-moving river. The world is in good hands, and the connections are secure, and there is nothing left for you to do but breathe and listen to the silence of the night. The history of the telephone is a history of people helping people, and the Hello Girls were the pioneers who taught us how to talk to one another across the void with grace and patience. Sleep now in the tranquility of a world that was built by these steady and silent guardians, and let the rhythm of the switchboard carry you into a dreamless and perfect slumber, where every call is answered and every heart is at peace. The night is long, and the rest is deep, and you are safely connected to the heart of the universe. The heart of Alexander Graham Bell belonged forever to the quiet world of those who could not hear, and even as his name became synonymous with the ringing of telephones and the hum of long-distance wires, he remained a man deeply rooted in the silent language of the soul and the delicate mechanics of speech. His lifelong commitment was a testament to the influence of his mother, Eliza, whose world of near silence he had sought to fill with the vibrations of his own voice, and his wife Mabel, who had lost her hearing as a child and became the steady light that guided his path through the complexities of fame and invention. Bell saw himself first and foremost as a teacher of the deaf, a title he carried with more pride than that of an inventor, and he spent his quietest and most meaningful hours in classrooms and study halls where the air was thick with the concentration of students trying to bridge the gap between their world and the world of sound. He believed with a gentle but firm conviction that the ability to communicate was the most fundamental of human rights, and he used his father's system of visible speech to help children find the resonance and the rhythm of a language they had never heard with their ears but could feel in the very bones of their being.
His legacy is a complex tapestry woven with threads of deep compassion and scientific rigor, because while the telephone brought the world together, it was born from a desire to understand the mechanics of hearing and the beauty of the human voice. He would sit for hours in a comfortable chair in his study, surrounded by books on anatomy and acoustics, thinking about the way a vibration travels through a membrane, just as it travels through the delicate drums of the ear, and he saw no difference between the copper wire and the human nerve. His invention fundamentally changed the lives of those with hearing impairments by bringing the study of sound into the spotlight of global science and by providing the financial means for him to establish the Volta Bureau, which became a sanctuary of information and advocacy for the deaf community across the United States. He was a man who moved between two worlds, one of vibrant noise and one of profound stillness, and he found a unique peace in the transition between the two. He would often retreat to his estate at Bay-en-Bray in Nova Scotia, where the wind off the
Finished, and the legacy is secure, and the world is waiting for the morning in a state of perfect and beautiful tranquility. Sleep now in the peace that comes from a life well lived and heart that was always listening, even to the things that could not be heard. The stars are bright and the earth is turning, and you are held in the gentle embrace of a history that was built on kindness and curiosity. Good night to the noise, and hello to the silence of a deep and restorative slumber where every dream is a bridge to a better tomorrow. The year 1915 marked a moment of profound and quiet triumph for the human spirit, as the vast and rugged expanse of the North American continent was finally bridged by a single continuous thread of copper wire stretching over 3,400 miles from the bustling docks of New York City to the foggy shores of San Francisco. It was a cold January day when the air was crisp and the world seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of a miracle of engineering that had taken years of patient labor and the steady hands of thousands of workmen to achieve. Imagine the immense silence of the Rocky Mountains and the lonely stretches of the Nevada desert, where the only sound for centuries had been the wind whistling through the sagebrush or the distant cry of a hawk soaring in the infinite blue sky. Now, across these wild and untamed spaces stood a line of wooden poles, like a row of silent sentinels carrying the weight of the human voice across the plains of Nebraska and the high peaks of the Sierra Nevada. The engineering feat was a masterpiece of hidden complexity, involving the use of vacuum tube repeaters that acted like small electronic hearts, pumping the fading signal back to life at regular intervals, so that the softest whisper in the east could be heard with crystal clarity in the west. On the day of the first official call, Alexander Graham Bell sat in a quiet room in New York, surrounded by a small group of witnesses, while his old friend Thomas Watson waited on the other side of the continent in San Francisco. The atmosphere was one of reverent calm as the connection was established through a series of manual switchboards across a dozen states, and when Bell finally spoke into the transmitter, he repeated the famous words from nearly 40 years prior, saying, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you." But this time, the distance was not a few feet down a hallway, but a journey of thousands of miles across the heart of a nation. The reply came back instantly across the wires, a steady and familiar voice that bridged the continental divide as easily as a person walking across a room, and in that moment, the geography of the United States was forever altered. No longer was a journey of weeks required to share a thought or a greeting, because the voice had become faster than the swiftest locomotive or the strongest horse. The transcontinental line was a physical manifestation of unity, a copper seam that stitched together the Atlantic and the Pacific and made the vastness of the country feel as intimate as a small town square. The workmen who had built the line had faced the biting frost of winter and the scorching heat of the desert, moving with a rhythmic persistence that mirrored the steady flow of the electrical current they were helping to harness. They had dug holes in the frozen ground and strung wire through the canopy of ancient forests, always moving toward the sunset with a sense of quiet duty and a belief in the power of connection.
The success of 1915
Defined rural American life began to dissolve like morning mist as the telephone reached out into the distant valleys and the lonely mountain cabins where families had spent months without hearing a voice from the outside world. For a mother on a secluded farm, the sound of the telephone's ring was a musical promise that she was no longer alone and that her friends and relatives were just a reach away across the wooded hills in the golden wheat fields. Emergency services were forever changed as the speed of a call replaced the desperate gallop of a horse, allowing doctors and firemen to arrive in those precious moments when they were needed most. And this gave every household a deep and restful sense of security that had never existed before. The culture of the evening began to shift as the parlor became a place of connection where stories were shared over the wire and the laughter of grandchildren could be heard by grandparents hundreds of miles away in a state of perfect clarity. The world was becoming a tapestry of sound where every thread was a human life and every knot was a shared moment of understanding, and this new intimacy made the vastness of the continent feel approachable and kind. Social customs evolved with the introduction of the telephone, as the art of the conversation became a cherished part of the daily routine, and the simple act of saying hello became a bridge over the silence of the night. There was a meditative quality to the way people would sit by the wall-mounted wooden boxes, listening to the clicks and pops of the early lines, and waiting for the voice of a loved one to emerge from the static like a lighthouse beam through the fog. The telephone brought a sense of democracy to the American landscape because the voice of a laborer and the voice of a banker traveled through the same copper wires and carried the same weight in the ears of the listener. The geography of friendship was no longer limited by the distance a person could walk or ride in a day, and this expansion of the heart led to a more unified and compassionate society. The town square was no longer the only place to gather because the switchboard had created a virtual square where the news of the day and the whispers of the town could be shared with the speed of thought. Imagine a quiet evening in a small town in the 1920s where the only light comes from the moon and the soft glow of a kerosene lamp, and the only sound is the gentle breathing of the house and the occasional low ringing of the telephone in the hallway. There is a profound peace in the knowledge that help is just a call away and that the world is no longer a place of frightening distances, but a place of near and dear connections. The telephone ended the era of the great silence and replaced it with an era of the shared word, which made every home feel like a sanctuary that was still part of the greater whole. The architecture of the American life was redesigned around this new ability to speak and be heard, and the result was a culture that valued the presence of the voice and the comfort of the spoken word over the coldness of the printed page. As you think about the way the telephone stitched the country together, let your own mind feel the warmth of that connection, and let the steady rhythm of the cultural transformation pull you toward a deep and tranquil rest. The wires are all in place, and the connections are all made, and the world Sleek glass rectangles in our pockets, but the intent remains the same, which is the simple and profound desire to reach out and touch another soul across the void. The transition from analog to digital was a slow and steady evolution, like the changing of the seasons, where the clicks of the switchboard became the silent pulses of a computer chip, and the copper wires were slowly replaced by the ethereal waves of the wireless world. Yet, in the heart of all this technology, there is still a deep and comforting stillness, because the goal of all this complexity is to bring us back to the simplicity of a single conversation and a shared moment of peace. As you think about the incredible journey from 1876 to the present day, let your mind rest on the continuity of the human experience and the way we have always sought to bridge the silence with the warmth of our voices. The internet is a vast and complicated web, but at its core, it is just a larger version of the network that Bell and Watson began to build in their small workshop in Boston. The world is now hyper-connected and always awake, but you can find a sanctuary of quiet in the knowledge that all these wires and waves are working together to keep the world safe and close. The fiber optics are buried deep in the earth, and the satellites are drifting silently through the velvet blackness of space, and they are all carrying the same message of connection and hope that started with a single call for help in a humid laboratory. There is a profound sense of security in being part of this global family, where every voice has a path and every heart has a home in the digital echo of the past. The story of the telephone has come full